Hey friends, welcome to a new week of teaching series. And this week we begin our new series exploring different meals in the Gospel of Luke. And particularly we're looking at meals that Jesus has with various types of people. And we're starting this morning with looking at the end of Luke chapter 10. It's just a few verses from verse 38 to 42. And we find that Jesus here visits the house of Mary and Martha. So let me read through it since it's a short little passage, and then we shall have a bit of a discussion about this passage. As Jesus and his disciples were on their way, he came to a village where a woman named Martha opened her home to him. She had a sister called Mary, who sat at the Lord's feet listening to what he said. But Martha was distracted by all the preparations that had to be made. She came to him and asked, "Lord, don't you care that my sister has left me to do the work by myself? Tell her to help me." "Martha, Martha," the Lord answered, "you are worried and upset about many things, but few things are needed, or indeed only one. Mary has chosen what is better, and it will not be taken away from her." Well, as we look at this passage, it's helpful really to look at what Luke records actually just before this passage within the rest of chapter 10. Because in chapter 10, what we find is there are three different narratives that are presented to us. First of all, there is the sending of the 72 from verses 1 through to 24, where Jesus sends out his disciples, the 72, the larger group of disciples, into the towns around them and says, "Go and proclaim the word of the Lord, go and preach the good news, and as you do so, look for those places that are receptive, that are open, where God is at work already. And once you recognize those persons and places of peace where God's work is occurring and people are receptive, then stay there. Stay in those places." Secondly, we find from verse 25 through to 37, we actually have the parable of the Good Samaritan. The one who shows what it really looks like to truly love his neighbour. And the message here for the teacher who asks the question to Jesus at the start about what must he do to inherit the eternal life, the message as he hears the story of the Good Samaritan is to actually go and do likewise. Go and do. And here at the home of Mary and Martha, we understand that it is Mary who has her priorities right. That even though Martha is busying herself in the kitchen and behind the scenes ensuring that everything happens correctly, that Jesus is cared for, that his disciples are cared for, Mary understands the context and what the context requires of her. That actually the right thing to do is to sit and to listen, to simply be at the feet of Jesus. And so we find within this chapter that we're presented with three helpful narratives. One which tells us to go and stay, to be open to recognizing where God is already at work, and once we find those places and those people, to stay there and invest in those relationships. Secondly, within the Good Samaritan, we're told as a disciple that there are times where we need to go and do, to love our neighbour and to step into that place. And finally, actually, we are reminded that there are times and places where what is required of us is to simply sit and listen. Now, as you hear this, you probably recognize that even within yourself, that there are tendencies to gravitate towards one or another of those particular intentions. To go and stay, to go and do, or maybe even to sit and listen. And what we find within these passages is it's not that there is one right or wrong necessarily, but that different contexts require a different response from us. And there are appropriate times, and Mary was absolutely right in recognizing that this instance required of her to sit and to listen. Now, for many of us, part of the challenge is understanding what does each opportunity, context, time, moment require of us. Is it a requirement to go and to stay, to recognize those places? Is it such a time where we need to go and do and to step in and be doing something, making something, creating something? Is the moment simply to sit and to listen, to learn what it takes to be like Jesus? A number of people over the last few days have really helpfully pointed out that everything actually starts at that place of sitting and listening at the feet of Jesus, of simply being a son or a daughter and hearing from him and receiving from him. For how are we meant to know where we are meant to go and where we are meant to stay? How are we meant to know where we are meant to go and do if we do not first and foremost sit and listen? Hear the word of the Lord. Hear God speaking into our hearts and our lives. Sense his leading of our lives to those places and people where we are joining him in his mission, in what he is already doing within this world. So as you think through this, not only am I asking you to consider what do you most naturally lean into, and how do you recognize those times where God is calling you to actually lean into one of the other opportunities, but also to ask yourself the question, does sitting and listening come first and foremost within your relationship and your response to Jesus? For that is